Why emotionally intelligent people attract the wrong people, every time. You have always seen things other people missed. The tension behind someone's casual tone, the longing hidden inside a cold response, the fear that lived just underneath someone's anger. You read people the way others read words, automatically, involuntarily, with a precision that sometimes frightened you. And yet, with all of that clarity, all of that depth of perception, you kept choosing people who couldn't see you at all. That is not irony. That is a pattern. And patterns, unlike accidents, have architecture. They are built from something. They repeat not because you are careless or naive or simply unlucky in love, but because something inside you recognizes certain emotional signatures before your conscious mind has time to evaluate them. Something in you responds, leans in, feels pulled, and by the time your intelligence catches up, you are already emotionally invested in someone who will, once again, ask more from you than they will ever be willing to give back. This is one of the most painful experiences a deeply feeling person can carry. Not the heartbreak itself, though that is real, but the confusion underneath it. The quiet, corrosive suspicion that something must be wrong with you, that your capacity to love is somehow broken. That the same sensitivity that allows you to understand others so completely is also the thing that keeps leading you into relationships where you are perpetually the one who understands, perpetually the one who gives, perpetually the one who stays long after the evidence has made clear that you should go. You are not broken, but you are operating with a psychological map that was drawn a long time ago, in circumstances very different from the ones you live in now. And that map, the one your nervous system uses to navigate intimacy, to recognize love, to evaluate whether someone is safe, was not built from clarity. It was built from survival. It was built from the specific emotional conditions you learned to navigate before you were old enough to choose which conditions to inhabit. The question is not why you keep attracting the wrong people. The question is, what did your emotional intelligence learn to call love, and where exactly did it learn that? You were never choosing people. You were choosing feelings. Think about the moments in your life when you felt most drawn to someone. Not the slow, rational appreciation that builds over time, but the immediate pull. The one that happened before you knew enough about them to justify it. The certainty, arriving too quickly, that this person was different, that something about them mattered, that you needed to understand them. Now ask yourself what that feeling actually was. Because for emotionally intelligent people, that pull is rarely about the person themselves. It is about the emotional frequency they emit, the specific quality of their inner world, the complexity, the hidden pain, the emotional depth that hasn't yet been articulated, that your nervous system detected before a single meaningful word was exchanged. You were not choosing a person. You were choosing a feeling. And the feeling you were choosing was one your system already knew how to navigate. This distinction is everything. When attraction operates primarily through emotional resonance, when you are drawn to people not by their character or their consistency or their capacity for genuine intimacy, but by the specific emotional signature they carry, you are not selecting partners. You are being selected by your own unresolved emotional history. The nervous system does not evaluate people the way the rational mind does. It pattern matches. It scans for the familiar. And for someone who grew up reading emotional complexity as a form of connection, emotional complexity will always feel more like love than emotional simplicity does, regardless of what it actually offers. The problem is not that you feel too much. The problem is that your emotional intelligence was calibrated inside a specific environment, and it learned to associate certain emotional frequencies with depth, meaning, and connection. Inconsistency can feel like passion. Emotional unavailability can feel like mystery. Someone who runs hot and cold can feel more alive, more real, more worth pursuing than someone who is simply and steadily present. Not because you prefer chaos, but because your nervous system was trained in an environment where consistent emotional presence was not the norm, and so consistency never learned to register as love. You never consciously decided this. No one does. It happened at the level of emotional wiring, long before you had language for it. And because it happened there, below the threshold of conscious thought. Your intelligence cannot simply reason its way past it. You can know, intellectually, that someone is not good for you. You can analyze the dynamic with extraordinary precision. You can see clearly what is happening, and still feel the pull, still stay, still find yourself making room for someone whose emotional capacity will never match your own. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence operating on the wrong map. The map was drawn in a different territory, one where love had to be earned through emotional attunement, where connection required constant calibration, where being deeply perceptive was not a gift but a tool for navigating an environment that was emotionally unpredictable, and you became extraordinarily good at using that tool. So good, in fact, that you began using it everywhere, on everyone, turning your sensitivity toward people who needed to be understood far more than they needed to be close to you. But if the feeling you were always choosing was never really about the person, then what was it really about? The childhood architecture of emotional hyperawareness. There is a version of emotional intelligence that develops naturally, from being surrounded by people who modeled emotional honesty, who named their feelings openly, who created enough safety that sensitivity could simply be sensitivity. And then there is a different version, one that was built under pressure. Most people who identify as deeply empathic, emotionally aware, or hyper-attuned to others did not develop those capacities in an environment of emotional abundance. They developed them in environments where reading the emotional room was not a social skill, it was a coping mechanism. Where sensing a parent's shift in mood before they entered the room was not intuition, it was preparation. Where understanding what someone needed before they said it was not generosity, it was survival strategy. This is a hard thing to look at directly, because it reframes something you may have always considered a gift. Your emotional depth, your perceptiveness, your capacity to understand others at a level most people never reach, as something that was originally built in response to emotional stress. Not from freedom, but from necessity. Not from love, but from the psychological imperative of a child trying to maintain connection with caregivers whose emotional availability was inconsistent, unpredictable, or conditional. When a child grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment, they develop extraordinary emotional radar. They learn to detect micro-expressions, to read silences, to sense the difference between someone's stated emotional state and their actual one. They learn that emotional attunement, truly understanding what someone is feeling and responding to it accurately, produces a kind of safety, a temporary regulation of the environment, a reduction of tension. And over time, this attunement becomes identity. It stops being something they do and becomes something they are. The deeply perceptive child becomes the deeply perceptive adult, and the deeply perceptive adult carries this survival architecture into every relationship they enter. Not as a wound, necessarily, but as a default mode of operating. They overextend empathy before it is warranted. They sense emotional need and move toward it automatically. They make room for other people's complexity before establishing whether those people are capable of making room for theirs. They give the benefit of the doubt not from naivety, but from a deeply ingrained pattern of prioritizing the emotional stability of others above their own. What they rarely examine is what this pattern cost the child who built it. The child who became hyper-aware of others' emotional states often did so at the direct expense of learning to stay present with their own. When your attention is constantly calibrated outward, scanning, reading, responding, adjusting, there is little space left to turn inward. Little practice in sitting with your own emotional experience without immediately reaching to understand someone else's. The capacity to feel everything about others coexists quietly, with a profound unfamiliarity, with the full texture of one's own inner life. And that unfamiliarity is not incidental to the pattern of attracting the wrong people. It is central to it. Why emotional unavailability feels like depth. There is a specific kind of person that emotionally intelligent people are drawn to with a consistency that defies rational explanation. Not cruel people necessarily, not obviously damaged ones, but people who are emotionally elusive, people who reveal something deep about themselves and then retract it, who are present and then absent, who offer enough intimacy to sustain hope, but never enough to produce security. These people feel interesting in a way that consistent people simply do not. And the reason for this is more specific than, we are attracted to what we can't have. That explanation is too simple and ultimately too comfortable. It lets the pattern remain mysterious, a quirk of desire rather than a function of psychological architecture. The truth is more precise and more confronting. Emotional unavailability mimics the emotional structure that many sensitive people learn to associate with depth, meaning, and genuine connection during the period when they were first learning what those things felt like. Unavailability creates tension. Tension demands attention. And for a nervous system trained to interpret emotional complexity as significance, sustained attention feels like intimacy. When someone is emotionally consistent, present, open, steady in their affection, clear about what they feel, the nervous system of a deeply empathic person can register this not as love, but as absence. The absence of the interpretive challenge. The absence of the emotional detective work that their system learned to associate with meaningful connection. There is nothing to read between the lines, because there are no hidden lines. And a mind calibrated for depth can mistake clarity for shallowness. This is one of the more disorienting patterns to recognize in yourself, because it means that what you have experienced as being drawn to depth may have sometimes been, more precisely, being drawn to the emotional labor of trying to reach someone who is not fully reachable. And the seduction of that labor is profound. It feels purposeful. It feels like you are seeing something in this person that others have missed, like your unique capacity for understanding can unlock something in them that no one else has been able to reach. Like love, at its most meaningful, should require this level of effort and perception. But there is a difference between depth and elusiveness, between genuine complexity and strategic withholding. Depth is someone who has done the inner work and can speak honestly about what they found there. Elusiveness is someone who has not done that work and keeps their distance from it by keeping their distance from everyone around them. One feels rich, the other feels rich, but only because your emotional intelligence keeps generating content to fill the space they leave empty. You have been doing their inner work for them and calling it connection. What happens then when someone offers you something different? When someone arrives who is simply, clearly, unhesitatingly present? The answer to that question is where the pattern becomes most visible and most difficult to sit with. The discomfort of being loved easily. Imagine someone who offers you their affection without ambiguity, who tells you clearly what they feel, who does not run hot and cold, does not disappear for days and then return with intensity, does not make you wonder where you stand, who is simply, consistently, genuinely there. For many emotionally intelligent people, this produces a feeling that is difficult to admit. Not relief, not safety, something closer to unease, a vague sense that something is missing, that this person, however good, however kind, however genuinely present, is somehow less interesting than someone who requires more effort, less passionate, less real, as though the very absence of difficulty is evidence of the absence of depth. This response is not a character flaw. It is a nervous system speaking in the language it was taught. A nervous system calibrated in emotional unpredictability learns to read the absence of tension as the absence of feeling. Calm does not register as love because calm was never paired with love during the period when the association was being formed. What was paired with love, or with the hope of love, was pursuit, was effort, was the intermittent reward of finally reaching someone who was usually difficult to reach. And intermittent reward, as every behavioral psychologist who has ever studied it will confirm, is the most powerful reinforcement structure that exists. More powerful than consistent reward. More addictive than reliable affection. This is why the wrong person can feel more like love than the right one. Not because the wrong person offers more, but because the pattern of what they offer matches the emotional template for what love is supposed to feel like. Exciting, uncertain, requiring your full attention, never quite guaranteed. And the right person, by simply being reliable, violates that template entirely. The discomfort goes deeper than attraction, though. For someone who spent years learning that love required earning, that connection was sustained through attunement, through making yourself indispensable, through anticipating needs and filling them before they were voiced, being loved easily can feel existentially disorienting. If you don't have to work for it, can it really be real? If someone loves you without requiring you to suppress your needs, manage your emotional expression, or perform a version of yourself designed to maintain their comfort, who exactly are they loving? You have identified so thoroughly with the performing, the managing, the earning, that straightforward love can feel like it is directed at someone you are not sure you know how to be. Consistent love can feel like it is asking you to exist in a way you have never fully practiced, and so you stay restless. You find reasons to doubt the person who shows up for you completely. You are drawn back, again and again, toward the emotional terrain that is familiar, not because it makes you happy, but because your nervous system knows how to operate there. Because fluency and suffering can feel, from the inside, indistinguishable from home. But if this is where you live emotionally, in the space between the longing to be loved and the inability to receive it without suspicion, then something even more fundamental is being lost. Something quieter. Something most emotionally intelligent people don't notice disappearing until they can barely remember what it felt like before it was gone. The hidden exhaustion of being the one who always understands. At some point, without announcement, you became the person people came to. Not just in romantic relationships. Everywhere. Friends brought you their pain because you held it well. Colleagues noticed you read situations accurately. Strangers sometimes told you things they had never told anyone else, because something about the quality of your attention made them feel that you could handle it, that you would understand, that with you, they did not need to translate or justify or minimize what they were carrying. You were, for many people, a rare kind of safe space, and you may have experienced this as meaningful. It is meaningful, but at some point, a point that is difficult to locate precisely because it arrived gradually, the role stopped being something you chose and became something you were expected to inhabit. Always. Without reciprocity. Without the same quality of attention being offered back to you. Without anyone thinking to ask what you were carrying. Because people who understand well are rarely asked if they are struggling. They are assumed to have already processed it. This is one of the more invisible forms of emotional loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you, who value you, who would say they love you, and still feeling in a way you cannot fully articulate that none of them actually know you, because you have spent so much energy understanding them that there has never been real space for them to understand you. And after a certain number of years, you stop expecting that space to exist. You stop reaching for it. You learn to meet your own emotional needs in private, to process alone, to be the last one you attend to. The exhaustion this produces is not ordinary tiredness. It is the exhaustion of a self that has been running at full output for a very long time, with very little incoming. Of emotional intelligence deployed perpetually outward, reading, responding, adjusting, holding, without the same quality of care being directed inward. It is the specific fatigue of someone who can feel everything but has learned to feel their own experience last. And in relationships, this pattern finds its most complete expression. Because the people most drawn to emotionally intelligent individuals are often, precisely, the people who need the most understanding and offer the least. Not out of malice, but because they have found in you someone who will do the emotional labor that their own avoidance prevents them from doing for themselves. Someone who will translate their unexpressed feelings back to them more articulately than they could have done alone. Someone who will stay present in the face of their inconsistency, maintain empathy in the face of their unavailability, and interpret their withdrawal as something other than what it actually is. You become in relationship the same thing you became in childhood. The one who understands. The one who holds. The one who keeps the emotional climate stable at the cost of their own. And somewhere in the quiet of all that giving, something begins to disappear. The slow erosion of your own emotional reality. It does not happen all at once. That is what makes it so difficult to track. It happens in small edits. You have a feeling, frustration, disappointment, a need that is going unmet. And before you express it, you run it through a filter. Is this too much? Will this create conflict? Will this make them feel accused, burdened, pushed away? And more often than not, you soften it. Reframe it. Find a way to express it that protects their emotional experience while quietly minimizing your own. You do this so automatically and so skillfully that it barely registers as a compromise. But multiply that edit across hundreds of interactions, across months and years of intimate relationship, and something cumulative happens. You begin to lose access to the original signal. The unfiltered emotional experience, what you actually felt before the translation, starts arriving less clearly, less urgently. The inner voice that says this is not acceptable or I need more than this grows quieter, not because the need has diminished, but because you have become so efficient at overriding it before it fully surfaces that it stops trying as hard to be heard. Self-abandonment at this level is not a dramatic event. It is a practice. It is the daily, incremental decision to prioritize another person's emotional comfort over contact with your own truth. And for someone whose emotional intelligence was built around reading and responding to others, it feels natural. It feels like empathy. It can feel from the inside like the mature choice, choosing connection over conflict, understanding over being understood, generosity over need. What it actually is a severance, a slow, quiet severing from the self. And the most insidious part of this process is that the people around you rarely notice it happening. They benefit from it. Your emotional steadiness makes their lives easier. Your willingness to absorb tension without escalating it, to hold complexity without demanding resolution, to stay when every honest signal in your body is suggesting you should go, all of this reads from the outside as strength, as maturity, as someone who is secure and grounded and whole. No one sees the cost, including sometimes you, because you are also extraordinarily good at explaining to yourself why the editing is reasonable, why this particular moment is not the right one to express this particular need, why patience is a virtue, and your discomfort is probably temporary, and the relationship has good things in it that outweigh what is missing. Your intelligence, meant to help you navigate the world, can also be deployed against yourself, generating justifications for remaining in situations your emotional body left long before your conscious mind was willing to follow. And underneath all of this explaining, all of this patient enduring, all of this quiet erosion, there is a belief, one that has been operating in the background for so long it barely feels like a belief anymore. It feels like reality, a belief about what love is and what it costs and what you have to be in order to deserve it. The belief underneath the pattern. Every repeated pattern has a logic. Not the logic you would choose if you were designing your emotional life from scratch, but a logic that was perfectly reasonable given the environment in which it was formed. A logic that, at some point, helped you survive something. And survival patterns do not dissolve simply because the original threat is gone. They persist. They generalize. They apply themselves to new situations with the same urgency they had in the original one, regardless of whether that urgency is warranted. Underneath the pattern of attracting people who cannot fully meet you, there is a belief. It is rarely stated explicitly, even internally. It operates below the level of articulated thought, in the space where emotional reflexes live. But if you were to translate it into language, it would sound something like this. Love is something I earn through understanding. It is not something I receive simply by existing. My needs are secondary to the emotional experience of the people I am close to. And if I ever stop being useful, stop being understanding, stop making room, stop translating, stop holding, the connection will dissolve. This belief was not chosen. It was constructed, built from the specific emotional feedback received during the years when you were learning what relationships were, what made people stay, what made them withdraw, what made you safe, what made you too much. And if the feedback you received during those years suggested, even subtly, that your emotional presence was more valued than your emotional needs, that you were loved most completely when you were most useful, most understanding, most accommodating, Then the belief became, I am lovable in proportion to how well I can suppress the parts of myself that require something. Emotionally intelligent people are particularly susceptible to this belief because their attunement makes it so easy to confirm. They feel when someone is overwhelmed by emotional demand. They sense when their need is coming at the wrong moment. They read the discomfort their vulnerability creates in others, and they learn quickly and precisely to stop before the discomfort arrives, not because they don't have needs, but because they have the emotional sophistication to see exactly how their needs land and to preemptively edit them out of the interaction before they can create any disruption. This looks, from the outside, like someone who doesn't need much, someone who is low maintenance, self-sufficient, emotionally secure, and the people who cannot hold emotional complexity are profoundly relieved to find someone like this. They stay. They call you mature. They benefit enormously from your willingness to carry the emotional weight of the relationship alone. And you interpret their staying as evidence that the belief is correct. That this editing, this suppression, this perpetual prioritization of their experience over your own is what makes you lovable. That without it you would be too much, too needy, too intense, too demanding of a reciprocity that you have quietly convinced yourself is unrealistic. But beneath this belief, there is something older and more fundamental than a fear of abandonment, something that does not live in thought at all, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that fire before choice is available. And until that something is understood, not analyzed, not explained away, but genuinely understood, the pattern will continue, with the quiet persistence of something that believes, on every level that matters, that it is keeping you safe. When empathy becomes a defense mechanism. This is the part of the pattern that is the most difficult to see, not because it is subtle, but because it looks, from every angle, like a virtue. Empathy is widely understood as openness, as the willingness to enter another person's experience, to feel what they feel, to let their reality matter to you. And it is all of those things. But empathy, like any psychological capacity, can be used in more than one direction. It can be genuine contact with another person's inner world, or it can be, and this requires a particular kind of honesty to acknowledge, a highly sophisticated way of remaining invisible. When your attention is always directed outward, you are never fully available to be directed at. Think about what happens in moments of genuine intimacy, moments when another person turns toward you, not to be understood by you, but to understand you. When someone asks what you actually feel, not as small talk, but as real inquiry. When someone offers you the quality of attention you routinely offer others. Many deeply empathic people find this uncomfortable in a way that surprises them. Not unpleasant, exactly. Exposing. As though being seen with the same precision that they see others would reveal something they are not certain they want revealed. As though behind the intelligence and the perceptiveness and the extraordinary capacity to hold others, there is a self they have never fully inhabited. A set of emotional needs, desires, fears, and contradictions that have been set aside for so long that being asked to produce them feels almost like being asked to speak a language they once knew, but have not used in years. Empathy, deployed in this way, is not connection. It is deflection. It is the direction of full, genuine attention away from the self and toward the other, not only out of care for the other, but out of a deep, unexamined reluctance to be known. Because being known requires revealing the parts of yourself that your emotional intelligence cannot control or manage in advance. It requires allowing another person to see you before you have determined whether what they will see is acceptable. And for someone whose sense of safety was built on the capacity to calibrate their emotional expression to the needs of the environment, that kind of exposure feels genuinely dangerous. So you become extraordinarily skilled at the kind of intimacy that keeps you safe. You share selectively. You reveal depth, real depth, genuine insight, authentic emotion, but at a level of abstraction that creates the feeling of intimacy without the specific vulnerability of being personally seen. You talk about your emotional experiences in ways that are true, but also subtly curated. You allow others to feel close to you while maintaining, Beneath the surface of that closeness, a quiet distance from your own most unprotected interior. This is not deception. It is the only way you learn to survive intimacy. But it produces, inevitably, a specific and profound form of loneliness, one that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it. A loneliness that lives not in the absence of connection, but in its presence, in the middle of relationships that feel close, in conversations that feel meaningful, in the company of people who would say without hesitation that they know you well. Because the deepest loneliness is not the loneliness of being unseen, it is the loneliness of suspecting that if you were truly seen, without the understanding, without the attunement, without the extraordinary emotional labor, there might be nothing left that anyone would stay for. The loneliness of being deeply perceptive. There is a loneliness specific to people who see clearly, not the loneliness of social isolation, not the loneliness of having no one around, the loneliness of being in a room full of people who are all, in some significant way, living at a different depth than you are. Of being in conversations that feel perfectly fine but also feel, to some part of you, like being in the shallows when you know there is ocean. Of connecting warmly, genuinely with people who like you very much, while sensing, with the precision that is both your gift and your burden, that they are not quite reaching you. This kind of loneliness does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates. It is the experience of repeatedly having insights about yourself, about others, about the dynamics of a situation, insights that are accurate and precise, and that you would struggle to share without either overwhelming someone or sounding like you are making the conversation about yourself in a way that feels presumptuous or strange. And so you hold them. You continue the conversation at the level it is operating. You match the depth that is available rather than the depth you are actually at. You have been doing this translation work your entire life, moving fluidly between the level of depth you actually inhabit and the level that the current person or situation can accommodate. Adjusting the register, softening the perception so it does not land as judgment, finding the accessible version of the truth without saying anything dishonest. And this translation is so practiced and so seamless that most people around you have no idea it is happening. But you know. You always know. And the knowledge of it produces a specific kind of fatigue. Not the fatigue of work, but the fatigue of perpetual partial expression, of living at a level of complexity that you can rarely share fully, because sharing it fully requires a listener who can stay with that level, who will not become overwhelmed or defensive, or quietly diminished by the clarity you would bring to them if you stopped filtering. People who are deeply perceptive often learn to be lonely in company rather than simply being alone, because aloneness, at least, does not require the work of translation. In solitude, there is no gap between the depth you are at and the depth the conversation can sustain. There is no need to manage how your perception lands on another person. There is no quiet editing of your inner life to fit the container of someone else's capacity. You can simply exist at the depth you actually occupy, without apology, without adjustment, without the constant low-level labor of being more accessible than you naturally are. This is why many emotionally intelligent people describe their solitude as more restful than their company. Not because they do not want connection, because the connection available to them rarely includes the full version of themselves. And this loneliness, this structural gap between the depth you carry and the depth that most relationships can hold, is perhaps the most honest explanation for the pattern this entire video has been building toward. Because if you have spent your life in relationships that cannot fully hold you, if you have spent years doing the work of translation and accommodation and making yourself accessible at the cost of being fully known, then the question is no longer why you keep attracting the wrong people. The question is something quieter and stranger and more important than that. What your pattern was always trying to protect. Every pattern that persists because it is doing something. Not something pleasant necessarily, not something you would choose with full awareness, but something, some function that, at the level where the pattern lives, justifies its continued existence. And the pattern of choosing people who cannot fully meet you, the pattern of giving without receiving, understanding without being understood, staying in relationships that confirm the belief that your needs are secondary. This pattern is not simply self-destruction, it is protection. Protection from something that feels, at the level of the nervous system, more dangerous than the pain of being repeatedly unmet. And that something is this: the terrifying possibility of being fully known by someone who is fully capable of knowing you, and finding out whether in that state of complete exposure you are enough. As long as you are with someone who cannot truly see you, you never have to find out. The person who is emotionally unavailable, who is too preoccupied with their own unresolved interior to turn full attention toward yours, they will never reach the parts of you that you are not certain are lovable. They will never ask for the version of you that lives beneath the understanding and the attunement and the extraordinary capacity to hold others. And there is a terrible safety in that. A safety that costs everything but delivers reliably the one thing the pattern was designed to deliver: the preservation of uncertainty. Because uncertainty, as painful as it is still preferable to the knowledge that you offered yourself completely, and it was not enough. This is what the pattern is protecting you from. Not from bad relationships, from the answer to the question you have been carrying, in one form or another, since the first time you learned that love might be conditional. The question of whether you, the full, unfiltered, unaccommodating, fully present version of you, are someone that another person can genuinely and completely love. Recognizing this does not dissolve the pattern. Nothing dissolves a pattern this old this quickly. But recognition changes the relationship you have with it. Because once you can see clearly what the pattern is doing, once you understand that it is not a failure of intelligence or a deficiency of character or simple bad luck in love, but a coherent psychological architecture built to protect something genuinely vulnerable, you can begin to ask a different question. Not why do I keep attracting the wrong people, but what would it feel like to stop protecting myself from the right ones? That question has no easy answer, and that is exactly why it matters, because you have spent years, perhaps a lifetime, being extraordinary at understanding others, at giving, holding, translating, enduring, and underneath all of that, there has been a self waiting, not a broken self, not a self that needs to be fixed or healed or rebuilt, a self that is, in all of its complexity and need and perceptiveness and exhaustion and depth, already enough, already worth knowing, already capable of being loved not for the labor it performs but for the reality it inhabits. Your emotional intelligence was never the problem. The map it was given to work with was. And maps can be redrawn. Not all at once. Not without difficulty. Not without the disorientation of choosing something unfamiliar when the familiar is so deeply grooved. But slowly, deliberately, with the same quality of honest attention you have always extended to others. This time, directed inward, toward the self that has been waiting, patiently and without much acknowledgement, for you to finally turn toward it with the same depth of understanding you have always offered everyone else. That is not the end of the pattern, but it is, perhaps, the beginning of the end of the belief that made it necessary.